Hi, I'm Hannah. Welcome back to Savage Reads, and I'm back. I don't know if you noticed that I was gone. I had pre-recorded some videos and put them out the past couple weeks, but I went to the US for 10 days and had the best of times. I went on my own, left my husband and kids at home, and went and saw some family, and it was wonderful to see everyone. But I am glad to be back. I am so glad to see my girls again, to see my husband, and to be back talking about some of the books that I have loved reading the past little while. I don't read a ton when I'm out visiting family. I don't even like to watch movies. I'm just so excited to see everyone. I just want to talk to everyone. And I probably have annoyed all of my family members by just wanting to talk to them the whole time I was out. It was just wonderful. So I have a few books that I do want to talk about, and just keep in mind the context in which I read them, because I think reading and listening to books on airplanes can really kind of color your judgment a little bit. It can either be the only thing that's saving you on this long plane ride, or it can be the most boring book ever because you were in an awful tube in the sky. So take what I say with a little bit of a grain of salt, but I have a few books that I'm really excited to talk about. So let's jump into that. The first book was a recommendation from Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and I picked up The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture by Gabor Mate and Daniel Mate. Now, this book is not typically the kind of book that I like to pick up. It's that genre of self-help that I just never know if it's super helpful for me. And so you might like this book more if this kind of book is more your jam. For me, I'm very skeptical. Every once in a while I run into one of these that I think is great, but a lot of times I go into it not quite sure. Now, this book, the main idea behind it is that a lot of our illnesses, mental and physical, are due to problems and traumas that we've had in the past, and how we need to deal with those in order to grow and move on and heal from our very real sicknesses that we have currently. And it talks about things in the culture and community that don't make it easy to connect with ourselves and heal. And I think the general idea of this is really great. I don't think there's much to disagree on that, okay, if you have some unresolved feelings that you're holding inside, they can make you sick. So I agree with the basic idea of the book. There was a chapter that talked about childbirth, and it was very spot on based on my personal experiences, right? So it talked a lot about that obstetric trauma and those feelings of violation and disconnect from the experience. And there were changes that need to happen. So I really did connect with that chapter. He has some chapters that talk about parenting. He talks a lot about cancer and other terminal diagnoses, and the improvements that a lot of patients have made and a lot of people have made by addressing deep-seated trauma and finding ways to move past that. And while I think on the surface level that's all really great, what I had a problem with in this book is I did feel like it was very closely walking that line between telling you, oh yes, it can be really helpful to deal with past hurts and past feelings and past problems and find ways to move forward. It was walking that line between that and telling you, well, if you're sick, it's because you're not good enough at dealing with your own problems. And why don't you just heal your childhood trauma and then your cancer would go away? And I feel like it kind of was leaning on the one side every once in a while. And of course, the author never is saying that outright in so many words, but the way that it's presented, I feel like there are so many times when it's, okay, you need to be a better mother, because if you're not a good mother, you're going to give your kid all of this childhood trauma. And for me, I'm prone to a lot of circular thinking, so I don't need that kind of stress. I'm trying my best to be a good mom, but I don't need to overanalyze everything I do, because that is not very healthy for me. And I also think that there are a lot of really difficult diseases, autoimmune diseases, cancer, terrible, awful things that people have to live through. But telling them that if they just healed their childhood trauma, it would cure them, feels like it's overstepping. And he walks that line between going over there and saying that, but I just felt a little uncomfortable with the way it was presented. He presented multiple cases of cancer patients that were healed in very miraculous ways, and they attribute it to their inner healing that they did. And saying that that is a cure almost feels a little irresponsible at times. Toward the end of the book, it did have some really great kind of advice, but I also feel like they were kind of basic platitudes. Give yourself space to meditate. Don't fill yourselves with things that won't satisfy you. How do you react to things? Are you seeing things creatively, or are you just reacting to your environment? Challenge the false beliefs that you hold to gain more insight going forward. It is a thing that I do not really like in self-help books, where it tells you a lot of things that are easy to agree with and sound profound and make you think, yes, that's it. But as soon as you finish reading the book, you completely forget what they are, because they aren't really actionable items that make sense and tell you how to fix things. And I felt like that's where it left me. And so there were bits of this book that were very relatable and interesting, but some of it was just overreaching or not actually giving concrete steps to help. And so the lasting impact that this book has had is, I joked about it with my sisters, and anytime they were talking about sicknesses or illness that they have, I just would say, oh yeah, I read a book. If you just dealt with all that trauma that we had as kids, it'd fix it. So that was fun. I had a great time doing that. But I just don't know if this book quite delivered on what I hoped it would. This next book was a recommendation from Sarah at Sarah MG Reads, and this one is a terrible book to read if you are going on long flights. So of course I picked it up. It is Drowning by TJ Newman, and this is a bit of a thriller that is dealing with a flight that takes off and shortly after takeoff crashes into the ocean. And it is the people who are trapped on the plane and the rescue efforts. And it is very exciting and engaging, and you want to see how they are saved. Do I think that it's going to stick with me forever? No, I feel like the impact was a little low. It's a solid read. Like, you read it, you're like, good book, like a great beach read kind of thing, because it's a thriller, it's engaging, but it also isn't anything that you have to put a ton of effort into. And I think the reason behind that is the characters are very one-dimensional and flat. And so the characters have their little types, they don't really surprise you very much, and it's just, I didn't feel like they even had a ton of character development. It had the obvious character development, but nothing that I thought was really impactful. But the plot was engaging, and it was a thriller, and it kept you going. So it was fine. I enjoyed it. The only thing that I'm really going to remember it for was that I read this while on vacation right before I took my nice long flight. And of course, I thought about that quite a bit getting on the airplane. So don't recommend this before you go on a flight, because you're going to feel a little freaked out. At least it's not a true story, because I don't think I would have been able to get on the airplane if it was like, this is a true story. I'm like, it's fiction, it's fine. You're gonna get on the airplane and everything will be fine. But yeah, this was maybe not the right one for when I read it. I read the book Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton finally. Everyone has recommended this book, and I have finally read it. I first put this on my list because of Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. This book is an eco-thriller. We have a group of guerrilla gardeners, we have a billionaire, and we have a man who is getting an award for his conservation efforts, and all of them converge on this one place that is on the border with a national park in Australia. This book starts out as pretty exposition heavy. We talk about some of the members of Birnam Wood, and it really goes into their philosophies and their thoughts and how they ended up where they ended up. And we also get the background of this billionaire and his state of mind, and it all comes together. And the third act is where it feels exciting and interesting and present. The first little bit was rather exposition heavy, and I didn't really love it. But I understand what the author was doing with it. At least I think I do. I feel like the reasons that those characters were given so much time to go into how they see the world and their political ideologies is that they were kind of stand-ins for those ideologies, and then it all comes together in the thriller toward the end. And I thought that it was kind of an interesting way to look at it, and you really needed to understand where they were coming from for it to be effective. But did I think the beginning of the book was a little dull and draggy? Yes. Did I also read it on an airplane? Also yes. So I wasn't quite sure if I loved that. I thought that maybe if the third act, if we had had maybe more of a dual timeline and had put it in between some of the exposition, maybe if we had seen more of the characters' motivations instead of just having them told directly to us, it might have worked better for me. But as it was, I felt a little hit over the head by things in the beginning, and then the end went by so quickly, I wasn't quite sure what had happened when I got to the end. I just feel like the author needed to take that end part, stretch it out, chop it up, and put it in the beginning part to kind of keep me more engaged and going, because it's a thriller and I want to not be able to put it down. And if I want to put down a thriller, is it very thrilling, right? It is a little bit different than some books that I've read, but it definitely was not my favorite thriller. Now, I have heard so many people talk about this book, but it ended up on my list because of Caitlin at Bandy's Books, and I read How to Say Babylon by Sophia Sinclair, and I am so glad that I read this. I can't believe I didn't read it sooner. I wish I had pushed it further up my list because this was so good. This is one of those 5-star memoirs. Not only is there an interesting story to tell, but the author knows how to tell it beautifully. And so we follow Sophia's life. It is her memoir. She's talking about growing up with a strict Rastafarian father and the difficulties that presented in her life. And she gives us some really great background. You feel like you understand Rasta a bit. You understand where her father, where her mother are coming from. She has such beautiful empathy for the people in her life and is able to express it well. I really appreciated that she talked about how she tried to write this memoir earlier and she had someone tell her, I think you need to wait to give yourself more space. And I really appreciate that. There have been so many times when I have read memoirs where the story is interesting, the person is interesting, the writing's even okay, but they didn't feel like good self-reflection. They felt like it would feel like the author was still too close to it to be able to see things in a more objective light. And I think that this was just lovely. Her thoughts about her family were so interesting. She didn't sugarcoat her life, but she also treated it with so much grace. And you can tell that she is a poet. The way that she writes is beautiful. She has that writing ability and the story to go with it. And so this book was fascinating and I highly recommend it. Probably is up there with some of my very favorite memoirs of all time. I was just so delighted that I picked this book up. So if you need a good memoir, check this one out and don't wait around like I did. I'm kicking myself that I didn't read it 6 months ago. This one should have ended up on the very top of my list. I didn't realize how good it was going to be. I'm so glad that I finally got to it. Highly recommend. And that is what I managed to finish while I was out on vacation. So if you have thoughts on these books, please leave them in the comments down below. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you all on the next one.